Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you all for joining us today. And welcome to our Scholar in Residence talk by Manjita Mukharji. For those of you who perhaps in the unlikely event don't know what the archive does, it's a public center for the history of science in contemporary India. And one of its activities is also to enable research from the collections at the archives. This work has been made possible through a generous grant from the TNQ Foundation. And as part of this grant, we have a research fellowship program and a scholar in residence program, which is an open call. So please keep an eye out for it. If you don't know what to, just go to our Join Us section on the website to know a little bit more about the program and to keep an eye out for the next call for applications. We're very, very pleased and honored and actually delighted that Manjita has spent so much time with us thinking about this over the last many months. And her work has probably covered a variety of disciplines over the years that she's been involved. Her research interests lie in the interstices of various kinds of knowledge and knowledge making. As she said, she did her PhD at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. I guess that's not what it's called anymore. I guess it's just called SOAS, no?
School of African and Oriental Studies, yeah.
Yeah, they like
both.
So she did her PhD at SOAS on the song texts of the bowels of colonial Bengal that situated itself in the intersections of literary study, history, and ethnomusicology. She also briefly taught at the University of Toronto and the University of Pennsylvania, and currently as the scholar in residence at the archives at NCBS. Her research project on the bird illustrations in the popular ornithological field guides of 20th century India seek to bring the fields of history of science and art history in conversation with each other. Her talk today is titled A Bird in Hand, Illustrating Scientific Realism in 20th Century Bird Guides of India. It's got a lot of interest. I think there might be some participants joining from Japan online.
Oh, wow. So, okay.
Over to you.
Thank you, Venkat. And thank you all of you for joining the talk. But first, huge thanks to the archives and the team. You guys are just fantastic. I've told you many times before, I'll just say it publicly. It's one of the finest archives I've had the pleasure to work with. That's right. Pictures, wrote Hugh Whistler, an English police officer and the last of the British Indian ornithologists in his introduction to his highly successful popular Handbook of Indian Birds. That's the book to your left. That's London, published in London in 1928, went through 4 editions. So that's the measure of its success back then. Are, and I quote, what the beginner requires. A few pages are worth pages of description. Invited by the Bombay Natural History Society, established in 1883, to produce and publish arguably the first popular illustrated work on Indian birds, Whistler's handbook sets out at the very outset to delineate the need for one. Despite the robustness of the existing books on Indian ornithology, and there were quite a bit, the untutored beginner, Whistler argued, was likely to be lost in the sea of scientific technicalities in these voluminous books, alongside lamenting either the unaffordability of the illustrated books because they were highly expensive, or the paucity of illustrations in these books in the ones that they could afford. The objective was thus clear: to popularize bird watching among the uninitiated. One needed to supply, and I quote, a well-illustrated guide to Indian birds at a price suited to the moderate purse. Not surprisingly, the handbook, with its original 17 illustration plates, of which 4 were in color, was an instant success, and subsequent enlarged editions came to include more and more colored plates. Now, Whistler's clarion call, or invocation of the power of the affordable picturesque, as I choose to call it, in engaging and educating the untrained eye, was complemented by the BNHS issuing in the very same year, that is 1928, illustration of 5 wall charts, a set of 5 wall charts of colored illustrations of 200 odd common Indian birds, primarily intended to popularize nature study in school. And these are all important markers. Primarily intended to popularize nature study in school and other educational institutions and sensitize young minds to the conservation of Indian fauna. These colored illustrations were not only reproduced by H.R. Baker and C.M. Inglis in their Humble, The Birds of Southern India, published in Madras, 1930, but also deployed most famously by Salim Ali, the Birdman of India, in his seminal Book of Indian Birds, first published in 1941, went through 13 editions. The very first low-cost popular bird guide published in India, boasting of 181 species illustrated in color. Thence, popular Indian bird guides of the 20th century came to be constituted by this triad of desired features. It had to have a combination of strict scientific accuracy, non-technical language, popular appeal, with concise accounts of life history and habits, and above all, good colored illustrations, supplemented by simple cues to field identification, not to mention being easy on the purse. Since then, illustrations came to dominate the genre of popular bird guides well into the early 21st century. Now, the centrality of illustrations, scientifically accurate illustrations, in the rise of the popular bird guides in early 20th century India begets a set of questions. What is the function of these illustrations? If it is, as the ornithologists claim, to popularize purposeful bird watching, and this is a quote quoting from Salim Ali and Dillon Ripley's very famous handbook, purposeful bird watching, that is by enabling the uninitiated lay bird enthusiast to accurately identify the myriad birds in the field, and then how natural or real or lifelike are these illustrations. Time and again, we hear Ali lament the lack of the scientific eye in the local indigenous artists who basically illustrated a lot of his early, lot of the birds in the early editions of the Book of Indian Birds. Yes, he laments the lack of the scientific eye, and also parallelly laments that they are not producing scientifically accurate birds, but will make do with what we have. What does training the scientific eye entail? And what do the scientifically trained ornithologists / artists' eyes see and render? Crucially, are these illustrations merely visual aids or passive supplements to the textual accounts of the bird's life history, habits, and habitats, or do they themselves actively shape emerging ornithological knowledge formations of the time alongside being shaped by them? Now, this is at the heart. This is basically my argument here. The set of questions that we will address through the slides here. In this talk, I will explore these set of questions through a tale of loss, both figuratively and literally, but of course the figurative first, because this is a talk after all in illustrations. And the literal loss we will trace through the series of figurative forgettings. What better bird to weave this tale of loss around than the Saras crane, a bird long held to be a symbol of eternal love and longing, pining, and pathos. We'll start with a quick look at the many visual renderings of the Saras back in time. The first one, so these are a set of images of the Saras that we could find in the Sanskrit mythology and literature. The earliest mention of the Saras is in the Ramayana, of course, written in the 3rd century BC. That's the first image here. That's the killing of the Saras crane by a hunter, and so profound was Valmiki's sorrow that he burst into a curse and the first verse, which is considered to be the ur moment of Sanskrit poetry, and birthing Ramayana in the process. This one, however, this illustration is from the freer Ramayana, which was the earliest and most profusely illustrated Persian manuscript of Ramayana, commissioned between 1597 and 1605 by Abdul Rahim Khani Khanan, a prominent courtier of Mughal Emperor Akbar and the sub-imperial Mughal patron, to maintain an independent atelier, an independent studio. The second image here is a landscape painting titled The Golden Geese in the Garden. It's from the illustrated folio from the Nala Damayanti manuscript in Deccani, dated 1699. The manuscript relates to the love story of Damayanti, I'm sure all of us know, and Nala. And we see a garden full of many species of birds. I hope you can see it. Many birds throng the garden. You find the first pair of Saras in the mudflats right here. And the second one is right there with their feet in the lake, in the water. Amongst other birds, golden geese glide along the deep gray waters of the sea. That's them. They're supposed to be messengers of love from Nala to Damayanti. The third is an untitled company painting dated arguably 1790 of a lady awaiting her lover, about to cast off her ornaments, approached by two saras cranes. It's likely an illustration of the Bipralabdha Naika, or the deceived heroine, one of the 8 Ashtanaikas of Bharata's Natya Shastra. So Bipralabdha Naika essentially embodies the emotional state of a woman who waits all night for her lover to arrive, but the lover doesn't do it. So she's dejected, deceived, angry, humiliated, and heartbroken. So this is one such image, a company painting, no doubt. The fourth one is the image of a Nepalese traditional Thangka painting, much more recent in the making, that takes on the, is there a way to zoom it? Like, I don't know if you can see the central image. Anyway, that takes on the wheel of life archetype and sets it on Saras conservation. There is a Saras sanctuary at Lumbini in Nepal, given how central Saras cranes are to Buddhism. And that's, of course, that central image of Siddhartha taking care, nursing a Saras crane back to life, a Saras crane that was shot by his cousin Devadatta, etc. That was the legend that it refers to. And of course, weaving around that is the story of Saras crane conservation in Lumbini, Nepal. It also, the Saras also features in Raghuvamsha, in Kalidas's epic poetry, Raghuvamsa, and that's here. And it's also in Charaka Chikitsthana, Charak Samhita, that's the Ayurvedic text, classical Ayurvedic text, where the Sarasa crane, it tells you, is an aquatic bird. His bones are useful in urinary problems. Now, while the Saras crane, the Sanskrit renderings of Saras were poetic and romantic, full of pathos and longing, we find the earliest detailed writings on the behavior and breeding of the Saras crane in the observations of the Emperor Jahangir, dating back from the early 17th century. In fact, the emperor, we are told in Tuzuke Jahangiri or Jahangirnama, here you have the translation there, that he had a pair of pet Sarases whom he called Laila Majnu, quite befitting his image of the forlorn lover, always an eternal lover than a ruler. And he even asked his court painter, Ustad Mansoor, to paint them. Very likely, it's the same Mughal painting. I could not ascertain whether it's the same one, but very likely it's the same one that Salim Ali referred to in his very famous two-part essay, The Mughal Emperors of India as Naturalists and Sportsmen, and that he published in 2 parts in the BNHS, Journal of BNHS in 1927, where he basically grandfathers Jahangir's natural history writings into contemporary bird ecology and habits. And it's being, I mean, he traces the genealogy of natural history writings way back to Jahangir. And in recounting the emperor's fascination for the Saras, Ali mentioned the emperor's meticulous observations on its territoriality, lifelong pair bonding, and nidification. While all of this is borne out by a reading of the Jahangirnama, I would like to draw your attention to the use of poetry in Jahangir's description of the pair bonding, something Ali does not allude to in his essay. And this is important, as we shall soon see. That's the couplet at the bottom of this image. My body melted away in heart-rending separation. My soul searing sigh burns like a candle. My day of gaiety has turned as black as the night of grief. Separation from you has made me like this. It's almost an embodied Saras pining for its lover, and Jahangir appropriates this voice and writes this couple of lines in poetry. These are important, the pathos, the affect with which you see the Saras being, all of that is being inscribed on the bird. Till we turn to the Saras in the 18th and 19th century English and European natural history writings. In the preface to Gleanings of Natural History, 1758, George Edwards, called the father of British ornithology, wrote that and he was also the illustrator of this one, wrote that, quote, where accurate figures are given, much pains may be spared in verbal descriptions, by referring to the figures which linearly describe the minutest parts of them, and such as would be very doubtfully understood by words only, end quote. This use of the figure demanded an accuracy that went beyond what was necessary in the depiction of animals and plants in conventional painting. As Thomas Pennant as well pointed out in the preface to British Zoology, quote, animal and vegetable life are the essence of landscape and often are secondary objects in historical paintings. Even the sculptor in his limited province would do well to acquire a correctness of design with a perfect knowledge of the muscles of animals. But the painter should have all this and more. He should be acquainted with all their various tints, their manner of living, their peculiar motions or attitudes, and their places of abode, or he will fall into manifest errors. Let's take this painting of the Saras, pretty stylized, as you can tell, both the fauna, the foliage behind it, and the Saras itself. Who was George Edwards, the father of British ornithology? His paintings were drawn famously from live animals for the first time, instead of from specimens or collections in the museum. So either live animals or recently deceased live birds found in private menageries of aristocrats, such as those kept by patrons and fellow naturalists, such as Sir Hans Sloane, stuff found in taverns and fairs like the Bartholomew Fair and the famous Parrot and Cage shop and other pubs on the Strand that dealt in rare and exotic animals. His illustrations in his 7-volume magnum opus, A Natural History of Uncommon Birds, were cited by Linnaeus in his Systema Naturae, in his 10th edition of that. They were all drawn from nature. Rather than relying solely on stuffed specimens or existing illustrations. This is an important thing that runs through all the 3 illustrations here. Elizabeth Willem, short bio, it's an 18th century watercolor painting by her. She was married to the puisne judge at the Madras High Court, Sir Henry Gwilym, until 1808. She painted a series of about 200 watercolors of Indian birds. Her works were known for its accuracy and natural postures, as they were drawn from observations of living birds. In India, Gwilym had the opportunity both to observe her subjects closely and to employ her skills in accurate depiction, etc. Notice, in particular, these 3 rough sketches, almost faint traces of sketches in the background. Also note the backgrounds in 3 of these. This is, of course, looks a little anomalous, but it has its own reasons. But the background habitat of both these 2 birds are rich in foliage. We'll comment on the naturalness of the foliage in a bit. The third illustration is from Franz Ernst Blau's A Monograph on the Cranes, 1897. It was a very beautifully illustrated project that was originally by the director of the Amsterdam Zoo, G.F. Westerman. However, his untimely death led to Blau taking over and finishing the work. The illustrations by Heinrich Lutermann here were made from live studies at the Amsterdam Zoological Garden. A quick note, I obviously can't cram everything. A quick note, 18th century, late 18th and throughout 19th century, there were a lot of import of exotic birds and animals into England and other places in Europe, Amsterdam being one of them, and into private aristocratic menageries, into zoos, into absolutely private collections. And these were the kind of painters that were called upon to paint them for either spectacular displays or for just natural history books. The background habitat is important because, as we shall soon see in the next slide, these are not the Saras's natural habitat. This is a highly nowhere kind of a foliage, utterly stylized, right? Even though it has a hint of water in the background, the Saras is essentially a bird of the wetlands, grassy wetlands, right? This foliage is stylized to the point of being really unnatural. It does not belong to the bird. This one, of course, has no such background habitat, except for the 3 Saras sort of accompanying this one. This one has a it's a bananas, like a coastal thingy, and the saurus isn't really found there. Remember, he drew from sauruses in the Amsterdam Zoo, right? He was also operating within what the Orient looks like. You know, tropical forests with rich, lush foliage. He has no clue what kind of a natural habitat the saurus actually can be found in. So we move on to the saurus, illustrations of the saurus in the early 20th century popular bird guides. And the first one is from Frank Finn, a very curious figure. We'll come to him in a bit, by Edward Neal. Edward Neal is his first oils and watercolors were exhibited in 1858, and first published work appeared in 1862 in John George Wood's The Illustrated Natural History. His illustrations went on to appear in several significant ornithological works published during the latter half of the 19th century. Now, his relationship with and work for Edward Thomas Booth, the guy who founded the Booth Museum, if you know what I mean. I mean, the Booth Museum was known for upending Victorian taxidermy displays and placing birds in their natural habitats in dioramas. You have the entire sort of, very realistic locales, and there were like full-size cases within which the background was painted as close to nature as possible, because Edward Thomas Booth himself was a hunter, and he knew he killed these birds in their natural habitats. He knew what the habitat looked like, and so on and so forth. So the background was as close to nature as possible, and the birds were placed very meticulously within them. It upended Victorian taxidermy in the sense that Victorian taxidermy displays up until then had birds like perching on a kind of a nowhere wooden pedestal, or like, extremely unnatural foliage behind, quite like the banana trees, the coastal saurus. So with this, 1915, and this is also incidentally an image that was used in the Human Marshall's Game Birds of India, which was mid-19th century. This is the second usage of the same image in Frank Finn's 1915. We move on to the next one. So yeah, the thing to be remembered is this one was illustrated the way it was because this man worked with someone who essentially observed birds in their natural habitats, not in abstraction, not in dislocation. So the next one by Henrik Grönwald, a Danish naturalist and artist known for his illustrations of birds. He was himself a skilled taxidermist, and his illustrations largely appeared in scientific periodicals such as the Proceedings and Transactions of the Zoological Society, the IBIS, and the Avicultural Magazine. Grönwald mostly illustrated birds and eggs. That's the saurus nesting, this one. Rare and newly discovered species from many parts of the world, and was among the last natural history illustrators to work in lithographs. This one, we are getting close, very, very close to what the saurus might look like in its natural habitat in the company of another saurus that's nesting. Here's, of course, another saurus that is accompanying this one. It looks very cartoonish, but anyway. We move on to the next one by Wandrekar. Unfortunately, we don't, or at least I haven't been able to get much by way of a bio about H.N. Wandrekar. Only that he illustrated for Salim Ali, and Salim Ali alongside J.P. Rani, who was also another illustrator that illustrated the birds in Book of Indian Birds. First, I think the first 3 editions featured birds drawn by Wandrekar and Irani. And we also, in the preface to all these editions, we hear Ali's by now a recurrent lament about how not lifelike the illustrations were. Right? So indigenous artists, according to him, were not naturalists themselves, and hence failed to produce accurate, lifelike birds. We move on now firmly. Which one? 41. Huh. No, there were taxidermy, there were stuffed specimens of, around. They were using specimens also, because there were also local taxidermists who the local artists did have access to, right? Anyway, we move to the mid to late 20th century popular bird guides, and this is very, very familiar to anybody who has taken a look at any of the sort of, the so-called popular field guides to birds of India. The first one is by D.V. Cohen. Violet Cohen, known for his botanical art more than her bird illustrations. Again, known for accuracy and such. But you see, with the 5th edition, Salim Ali is breaking a lot of old grounds. Whether by compulsion, or not, we don't know. But the preface says one of the many things that is introduced to this particular edition, the 5th edition in 1955, is the use of multi-species plates instead of a full figure illustration per bird. And we'll get into the reasons, the whys and the wherefores in a bit. So you see, multi-species, multi-species, multi-species. The second one, of course, is by A.M. Hughes, a very interesting guy. You almost find nothing about him till, thank God for blogs, till a very, very, detailed blog entry on him describes him as a Royal Navy officer and ornithological illustrator, illustrated Geoffrey Hercloth's Hong Kong birds. What is of importance to us is he collaborated with C.B. Ticehurst, Claude Buchanan Ticehurst, who, if you remember the first book we began with, Hugh Whistler's Popular Handbook, Hugh Whistler and Ticehurst collaborated very, very closely. So here I'm tying A.M. Hughes back to Whistler through Ticehurst. You will find Hugh Whistler acknowledging profusely Ticehurst's sort of contribution to the making of Popular Handbook in terms of his having read his manuscript over and over again. Later on, also Ripley and Ali's book, the handbook that comes much later, that's this one in the middle that he's drawing for. This handbook was essentially based on copious field notes made by both Whistler and Ticehurst together. And they, of course, died almost consecutively, and field notes were passed on to Ripley and Ali by Mrs. Whistler, Joan Whistler. But anyway, so this is an ornithologist who is also an artist, drawing his own birds, but of course coming into Dillon, Ripley and Ali's world through Ticehurst. The third one is, of course, Carl de Silva, Goa-based, internationally renowned wildlife artist and naturalist, especially known for his bird illustrations, joined the BNHS as a staff artist in the mid-1980s. Between 87 and 92, he exhibited his artwork at London's small galleries on the invitation of the Society of Wildlife Artists, becoming the first Indian artist to do so. His most significant work and perhaps a seminal contribution to Indian bird arts were his illustrations for the popular Helmfield Guide. That's the one. You see the last image, the birds of the Indian subcontinent. And he also very famously illustrated the birds for Salim Ali's 13th and the last edition of Book of Indian Birds. Again, so what is common is, and we'll get into it in the very next slide, the background is steadily dissolving, almost into nothingness. There is a little bit of a hint of a grass out there, but extremely few and far between. It's a white background. The birds are stiff, standing. They almost look like specimens rather than living birds in the field. So what is lost? So sorry, right? Here I go again. Okay. What is lost? From naturalism to scientific realism. So background habitat indicators such as branches, trees, wetlands, grasses, marshes, etc., steadily give way to the sterile white background of high contrast scientific illustrations. Birds are static creatures, not seen in action, whether preening or preying, threatening, courting, nesting, etc. Individuated, not in company of other birds. They are sole birds standing against a white background. Whether in pair or flocks of its own kind in the company of other birds, non-humans or humans inhabiting the same locale. And this loss of socio-cultural milieu, loss of symbolism, local names and lores. Even in the textual little descriptions that go along with these images, you will find they are steadily being denuded of any kind of local names or symbolism or anything else that the bird embodies in the socio-cultural worlds or locales. So the birds are almost abstracted and placed against a white background, sterile, individuated, and completely losing everything that does not make sense to the science of birds. So these are images I took from Carl de Silva's sketchbooks, almost like for 5-6 years, sketchbooks. And you see this one, I don't think you can read it. This is, of course, the great Indian bustard threatening a mongoose. This is long-legged buzzard bullied by spotted eagle, 2 spotted eagles waiting for the jackal to finish feeding. This one has interested female. That's the female dancing in air. And those are the 3 bustards preening. Those are the 2 bustards fighting. None of which you see in the field guides. They remain in the sketchbooks. They're part of Carl's way of learning more about bird behavior and bird life habits, everyday habits, and so on and so forth. But none of these images, contrast them with the images that you just saw. None of these make it to the bird guides. Can you help me? This is not working. Okay, sorry, just did. That's fine. Huh? Oh, to there. I see. Okay. So anyway, one of the many reasons why this is happening, the loss, we can start explaining the loss through taking a look at the shift from one genre of popular bird writings to the rise of the scientific ornithological field guide genre. Earlier, what existed before Ali, Ripley, Whistler, etc., came onto the scene was a series of extremely delightful Anglo-Indian writings on birds and generally animals, on wildlife. So these, I'll get into the images in a bit, but this was the stuff of E.H. Aitken's books about birds. A book, The Common Birds of Bombay, was in Salim Ali's memoir, The Fall of a Sparrow. This is a book, Ali tells us, that has endured his entire life and is one of his, probably the most favorite bird book ever. And he chooses to go back to this particular book again and again throughout his entire life. Now, who is this guy? H. Aitken, one of his books is A Naturalist on the Prowl. The images are sharper there. The Naturalist on the Prowl. And these are essentially stories about humorous sketches about birds to be found in their immediate environment of this guy, or in the surrounding sort of, jungles of his bungalow. It's not too far. These are not about faraway places, faraway birds, nothing exotic about them. Very quotidian birds in quotidian settings in sort of, everyday sketches. So here, these are, this is only one example of it. Take a look at the table of contents there. It says, on the prowl, sorry, I can't read properly. The voice of mirth. It says, on the prowl, the voice of mirth, the banyan tree, bird nesting, the tillers of the soil. Make no mistake, these are not chapters that are only talking about birds. These are talking about, let's say, a banyan tree. Who inhabits the banyan tree? It's a squirrel to a cicada to a bird to what have you. So it's talking about animals that are interconnected. It's talking about what you see, frankly, right? If you live in a bungalow and you look at a tree, a banyan tree, sort of, what do you see? You just don't see individuated birds. You see birds in the company of other birds or of its own kind, or in the company of animals, so on and so forth. I'll just read out, because I'm biased. I love this genre. I'll just read out an excerpt from, do we have time? From The Naturalist on the Prowl. So H. Aitken was essentially an Anglo-Indian born in Satara, Bombay Presidency, pretty much lived all his life in India till he went back to England later in life and hated it. So he talks about a young bulbul that was brought to him in a dilapidated state. It had lost its leg. It was brought to him by a local boy, and he essentially nursed him back to health. And he says, nothing kindled. So yeah, he says, and he nursed him back to health, but this bulbul unfortunately did not last. So he says the last few lines of this sketch, poor Billy, he calls him poor Billy, enjoyed the two principal conditions of longevity, a good digestion and a small mind. But he got fits and died early. Billy was a red-whiskered bulbul, the species which an old naturalist in a happy moment called Otocampsa jocosa, under which name you will find it in Jerdon. It's a very telling line. And this is, of course, littered throughout his books and sketches. He gives you scientific names. He gives you keen scientific observations, right? About nesting, about behavior, about habitat, all of it, but he chooses to call the bulbul poor Billy. You know, and again, and he obviously loved bulbuls. You know, there was another one, which is here. He almost goes into another bulbul, a green bulbul this time, that he cared for, and it too died. He says, I grieved for that green bulbul more than I generally do for lost pets. I almost said, love not, the thing you love shall die. But no, I cannot accept that sentiment. It is moral imbecility. I believe that the words of the clear-eyed and sound-hearted poet who has gone from us are true of all bereavements, little and great. He goes on to quote Tennyson, I hold it true, whatever befall, and feel it when I sorrow most. 'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, right? So it's interesting, and this is the sort of genre of popular bird writing that thronged the market at the turn of the 19th century, like late 19th century, early 20th century, and so on and so forth. Douglas Dewar, whose book, this one, is dedicated to Glimpses of Indian Birds, published in 1913, is dedicated to Theodore Roosevelt. Douglas Dewar was not an Anglo-Indian himself, British civil servant in India, but also an ornithologist who wrote columns in newspapers such as the Madras Mail, Pioneer, Times of India, and periodicals such as the Civil and Military Gazette and Bird Notes. Now, he dedicates this book to Teddy Roosevelt, and he says, that's the one, a hunter of big game and a naturalist who, having brought common sense to bear on the problems of natural history, declines to be dictated to by those who have constituted themselves zoological authorities. And the next image, the Jheel out of season, is part of that book. Let's read. One of the Saraces, like the heroine of the Penny Dreadful, he says, has drawn himself up to his full height, and his gray form, relieved by patches of red and white on the head and neck, shows well against the background of dark foliage. His mate is apparently sitting down. This probably indicates the presence of a nest. To discover this, we must wade and chance an occasional immersion to the west. Risking this, we advance to the disgust of the Saraces, who set up a loud trumpeting. Sometimes the parent birds attack the intruders. Such conduct is, however, rare. Usually, the Saras indulges in Lloyd Georgian methods of meeting an enemy, right? So the kind of humor that is shot through all these kind of descriptions, and he goes on his rant against the zoological authorities and the rise of modern ornithology, scientific ornithology taking over the genre of bird books, is best explained in the preface to The Birds of the Plains. No, not the preface, sorry. In one of the chapters of Birds of the Plains, 1909. And I won't read the entire sort of image, but it starts off by saying the ornithological world is peopled by two classes of human beings. There are those who study nature inside the museum with the microscope and scalpel, and there are those who live to observe birds in the open and study their habits. He pits himself. It's a rant. That book is a rant. Like starting from the preface to the chapterizations and so on, he refuses steadfastly. Like, here I am writing humorous tales about birds I see in my, everyday goings on, etc. And I'm going to anthropomorphize it, no matter what. So what are the basic features of this particular genre of bird writing? Short vignettes mixing keen natural history observations with a strong streak of facetiousness, use of storytelling, personal anecdotes, memoir, anthropomorphic metaphors, literary references, quotidian birds in the complex sociocultural web of humans and non-humans, deployed by Anglo-Indians and British residents, civil servants too, like E.H. Aitken, Douglas Dewar, Frank Finn. Those are the two birds, Frank Finn's Birds of Calcutta. Once again, see how he's introducing his birds with quotations from Chaucer, proud and pert as is a pie, the Indian magpie and the myna, I am not black in my heart, though yellow is my legs. So, from Shakespeare. I mean, Aitken even goes, he loved crows. Aitken loved crows. He called the crows kind of, I mean, he likened them to Sherlock Holmes because they were so intelligent and so on and so forth. So, however, so this is a genre that deliberately self-identified. I mean, these guys, these bird writers who were also scientifically trained ornithologists, make no mistake, but they called themselves naturalists because they were pitting themselves against formalized, institutionalized scientific ornithology, and as distinct from museum ornithologists or ornithological systematists. They were ultimately not considered scientific enough, and we'll soon see why. Let's just, before this is a timeline of the Indian ornithology. You don't find Aitken anywhere. Aitken is also one of the founding members of BNHS. So the guy had stature. He was a very prominent person, writing at least 5 or 6 books. You do not find Aitken here. You find Finn and you find Dewar there, but these guys are forgotten in prefaces and introductions and citations from subsequent bird guides, at best fleetingly referred to and generally forgotten. People who are, of course, like copiously cited, and the citational politics, as we all know, being academics, is part of the canon formation. Right? The canon is formed along people. This is a seamless almost canon with slight breaks with Finn and Dewar of people who were not only trained in scientific ornithology, but also wrote in that genre, right? So the rise of modern scientific ornithology, which marks much of the loss, and this is mapping the loss part 2 of the genre, the making of the genre of the field guides, the 20th century popular bird guides. So canon formation, steady erasure of Aitken, Douglas Dewar, and Frank Finn. It moves from specimen and egg collection to organized field surveys and observations of living birds in the natural habitat, which is Ali's words, marked by emergence of popular field guides and handbooks that focus on biodiversity, taxonomy and conservation, emphasis on field identification, classification, geographical coverage, and species distribution over depth or local names of sociocultural associations. The prose is dry, minimalist, objective or dispassionate record of facts, essentially pedagogical, instructive, use of Latin names instead of local names, part of the standardizing process through contextual erasures. It's shaping the public eye, the popular eye of the popular field guide reader is being steadily professionalized. It's been steadily being shaped into that of the scientific ornithologist, right? So these are images here. This is from the preface of Ali's first edition of Book of Indian Birds. He straight up says that, I'm not going to give you local names. Local names are not stable, he says, right? You cannot standardize. Like one bird, which is called the Garuda, applies to the vulture as well as to the hornbill and the green pigeon. So it's not going to be helpful for the reader. Who do you see, right? And then he says the Latin names, again, the same argument goes on to say that internationally, the Latin name also works as science has a universal language, right? Which is Latin in nature, that anybody, whether from India or from Europe or from anywhere, any part of the world, will be able to identify. And he says that, the practice of employing a uniform Latin terminology is current throughout the modern scientific world. It is a boon to workers in different countries since it's more or less constant and enables the reader of one nation to understand what the writer of another is talking about, and so on and so forth. This is part of the standardizing that we so very visibly see in happening from 1941 onwards. This is an excerpt on the Saras crane from the Helmfield Guide, The Birds of Indian Subcontinent. Look how bare the description is. It's like minimalist to the point of just identify the features, a little note on the geographic distribution, juvenile adults, male, female, etc. And that's right. And the voice, a loud trumpeting, and so on and so forth. Cultivation, the habitat marker, right? That is what it boils down to. However, let us remind ourselves, this is supposed to be a popular field guide, trying to tutor the bird enthusiast, the common bird enthusiast. And of course, Salim Ali very, very, he says, above all, it is important that sentimentality should be kept in check and to remember at all times that the behavior of birds cannot be interpreted entirely from human standards. Birds do not possess the power of reasoning, therefore their actions, however intelligent they may seem, are essentially no more than instinctive reflex. This flies in the face of all the Anglo-Indian humorous sketches about birds where anthropomorphism is the name of the game there. And also older visual renderings of the Saras where it's being likened to affect, emotions, and emotional states, rasas, what have you, right? But why is it becoming so minimalist? Another reason why, or through which we can explain this loss, is brass tacks price, affordability, right? The cost of printing, the cost of doing a full figure illustration for every bird in a compendium, in a handbook. The costs were rising. Earlier, patronages worked through individual business magnates such as Arthur Varney, American huge businessman, or princely state rulers who copiously funded Ali's many field surveys and so on and so forth, or wealthy ornithologists themselves like Lok Wan Tho, who financed Ali and Ripley's field surveys and so on and so forth, which led to the Handbook of the Birds of India, right? The World Wars and the economic depression meant that the color charts were far more expensive. Everything, essentially prices rose, and it also affected the print market. The rising cost of color printing that Ali refers to here, this is the preface to the 5th edition. Sorry. This is the 5th edition where he's saying, this one, the present high cost of color printing, it was not feasible to retain the original arrangement of devoting a full plate to each species. A compromise was essential if the book were to be published at all and at a price that would not greatly narrow down its circle of usefulness. In actual practice, this resulting arrangement of 4 species on a plate should not materially detract from convenience of cross-reference to the descriptive text, and so on and so forth. Right? So these were, and this is also Carl de Silva writing to another sort of publisher for another field guide much later on in the day, 2005. He's like, how many species, what size and format, and what's the structure, what's the target audience, what's the budget? Essentially, how much do you mean to pay me, right? He was being paid upwards of £200 per illustration back in the 90s, which was a hefty money. However, only if it's per illustration. If it's multi-species on like a single color plate, that dried up. And the costs were incredibly high. That's also another letter that is being written to Ranjit Daniels, another ornithologist, come artist himself, later on in the day. And he's saying that, you know what, if you can't get the rest of the images that you so want to include in this particular book, then why don't you apply for some kind of a subsidy? It will have to come out from your payment stipend for the book than from our fund budget, right? So there's a constant sort of, scuffle between the artist and the sort of either the author or the publishing house about the rising cost of color printing and how much they can actually. So there's brass tacks. One way in which we can rationalize the loss is also this, that how can you make it more and more affordable? However, and this is where we are getting more sort of conceptual and trying to trace the literal losses through the figurative renderings and the forgettings, etc. How do these losses start to naturalize themselves without looking like things are being lost, things are being trimmed down or pared down? She says, Virginia Mary Peterson, wife of Roger Torrey Peterson, the inventor of the modern field guides, Peterson identification key was like huge. It kind of overnight changed the face of field guide genre. She says a drawing can do much more than a photograph to emphasize the field marks. A photograph is a record of a fleeting instant. A drawing is a composite of the artist's experience. The artist can edit out, show field marks to best advantage, and delete unnecessary clutter. He can choose position and stress basic color and pattern unmodified by transitory light and shade, whereas a good photograph can have a leaving immediacy. A good drawing is really more instructive. This falls right in line with what the artists are doing and being asked to told, right? Oh, by the way, that's all three are images of Carl in the field, sketching at home, copying from other illustrations. If you can see, other books are peeking out from the right-hand side of the margin. And here he is sketching from a freshly ringed bird, holding a living but ringed bird in his hand and sketching, right? The various visual technologies, remember, what does an artist actually use? How is Carl looking at the Saras, remember the bustards, preening and threatening and so on? How does it actually happen, the process of drawing? We are also told by, this is a fantastic handbook of scientific illustration, Nancy Halliday, the author of the bird illustration chapter, tells us of the number of sort of, the tools that you actually use, rulers, measuring devices, stereoscopes to specimen props, like how to wetting agents and preservatives, what have you. And then she tells us, if you are drawing from a specimen, these are the things that will go wrong. The feet and toes will lose the softness and fullness of life and become quite shriveled. Color is also faded. Only the illustrator's knowledge of birds and artistic skill can restore this little mummy to life again. She goes on to say, if you're drawing from other illustrations of, this is the problem you will run into. And if you're drawing from photographs, again, basic posture, yes, facial expression, yes, toe placement, great, but you cannot. This is a very telling line. The mindless copying of photographs with every accidental feature, such as out-of-place feathers, emphasized just as the camera caught it, while important and anatomical characteristics are left undelineated, which is to say the bird, as you see it, will have out-of-place feathers, will be ruffled, might be in the process. There's a fantastic sketch of Carl, by Carl, of, I think, a myna before regurgitating and after regurgitating, like a fat myna and a slimmer myna, because she just sort of, regurgitated. So those are the things that you see in life, and they are being standardized, trimmed away, and stabilized in a way to emphasize the identification features of this bird. A certain idealization is happening through standardizing processes. Again, the zoo, etc., birds in confinement will be often altered. Old age, long captivity can produce excessive growth of the beak, etc., etc. And then she goes on to say that field guides often demand definitionally simplified commercial treatment, accentuating colors and patterns. The birds are usually idealized and portrayed as vignettes with local color emphasized and highlights and shadows minimized, and so on and so forth, right? So these are the visual technologies that render the losses and stabilizes the bird. The making of the ideal bird. Now, drawing, as Jim Endesby in his brilliant book on the professionalization of botanical science through the career of Joseph Dalton Hooker, delineates, he says that drawing is not a passive act of recording nature, but of investigating and producing nature. And that is part of my argument here. It is through the learning the conventions of depiction in order to identify their pictures as scientific illustrations, naturalists internalized a code of rules that helped establish what they could and could not see. Copying is a pedagogical technique. You copy from other you copy from either a specimen or you copy from other illustrations. What is it doing? You're internalizing the conventions of drawing, the conventions of scientific drawing, learning the ornithological topography and terminology, anatomy, coloration, etc. Most crucially, learning what a type specimen is. There are thousands of specimens, right? There is only maybe a handful of good specimens that are used, like that parakeet up there, right? That is used to draw the parakeet, one of many. Like there will be an illustration of the parakeet, there would be a specimen of the parakeet, and then there would be his own sketchbook of the, the many sort of, behavior of the parakeets and series of sketches and so on. Copying is also a stabilizing, standardizing technique. Copying from specimens and other scientifically accurate bird illustrations of photographs, like the one he uses, Eliot's, that bird is from John Gould's Bird of Asia. Again, a very famous mid-19th century book, right? That pheasant. And also that one is even older. I think that is 18th century easily, William von Wright's illustration. He's also using these birds as one of the reference points for his own bird drawing. So what does it do? Copying from specimens and other scientifically accurate bird illustration or photographs rather than copying from nature. Correcting and trimming away imperfections, deviations, idiosyncrasies, and distractions, the out-of-place feather, let's say, produce the typical form, thereby stabilizing, standardizing, and idealizing a particular species. Here, in this particular, in this particular image down here, you see the left tibia is not seen. Carl is writing that. This is a bird in the field. This is how it stands. The left tibia is not seen. So you do not see certain birds, and you're reconstructing the bird in the process by referring to other pictures of the birds in other sort of bird guidebooks and so on and so forth. Hence, and here too, the wing is drooped while preening. You do not draw this bird with a drooped wing, right wing, right? So the typical form of a bird is a form that might never be actually seen, showing these illustrations do not show what the bird looked like in the field, but what it ought to look like. There is an idealization happening here. Producing the bird in hand, the final image of the bird is produced through, this is a letter between Carl and Steve Madge, one of the authors of Peasants, Partridges and Grouse, the Helm Field Guide, again, not Birds of Asia, but a general bird guide of the world. He's saying, that bird, the male bird's wing is longer or bigger, or the preferred the female. The female isn't really sitting or standing. I prefer the female to be in a walking horizontal posture, head too fat, bill to tail notch is not showing, but it needs to be shown. So on and so forth. These are corrections, constant corrections that the artist has to take on and render his illustrations. So these are, of course, markings. This is, again, Steve Madge marking on a fax copy of Carl's sort of plates, illustrations. And this is the final product. And again, he says, you can throw a hint of dark forest around things. Background really doesn't matter. Right, just draw something, like make it look nice with some kind of a hint of a background. It doesn't matter, like whether it looks real or natural or anything. A hint of dark forest around figs wouldn't go amiss, right? So this is the making. This is the story of the loss and the making of the typical bird that emerges out of that loss, the bird that you have in hand. Right, in conclusion, by the way, this image is like, the tracing paper. No, this is like a final, I think, pre-final sketch of the bird, one of the plates that goes into, Salim Ali's Book of Indian Birds, the 13th edition. In conclusion, I would like to invoke one definition of the observer that Jonathan Crary, a famous art critic and an art historian as well, points out. He defines an observer as, I quote, one who sees within a prescribed set of possibilities, one who is embedded in a system of conventions and limitations of a particular place and time. He's talking about the historical construction of the observer. The word observer itself comes from the Latin observare, to conform one's actions to comply with some set of rules. The moment we take this definition on board, we start seeing that the observer in Aitken, the observer in Frank Finn, the observer in Ali, and the observer in, say, Carl, filtered through or refracted through Steve Madge and what have you, are all different subjectivities, right? Impacted or defined, determined by the set of conventions, whether that is genre convention, artistic convention, what have you, print, actual print cost, like economic conventions, and so on and so forth. It's the observer is a historical construct, and hence what he's seeing will also be similarly mediated through these conventions and these possibilities. Seeing itself is a rendering. It's not so much the illustration as a rendering, but seeing itself as a rendering, a mediated subjective act. Verisimilitude or truth to nature is yet another construction mediated by technologies of visual conventions and limitations. And scientific objectivity and accuracy, I contend, produces, like we have seen, its own idealizations. Bird illustrations in the 20th century popular field guides, hence, is a newer arrangement of knowledge, but yet another, not the arrangement of knowledge about birds, one that is produced not by an unmediated access to nature and realism, but by a cycle of scientific observation, erasure, mimesis, and standardization. The bird in hand, hence, is an idealized trace of the one in the bush. At best, a yearning for what is lost. Thank you. Sorry, it took a long time.
Thanks so much, Manjita. We have time for questions. Any questions?
Thank you for your interesting talk. So it essentially dealt with the field guide, but I feel that there is a little bit of mixing up with all ornithological literature, and that field guide art is also being mixed up with all bird art. So one of the important evolutionary phases in the field guide, and one of the drivers that has made many of the observations that you make, is actually capitalism. And there is a well-known book, which you would doubtless have seen, which is Spencer Schaffner's Binocular Vision. And he talks about how bird study in the US is sold as a form of conservation awareness and other things. And then he talks about how it actually, finally in the field, it's completely contradictory, and most of them are flying a huge amount of carbon footprint and working with the industries that destroy nature in its own course. There's another book which is I forget the author. It's bird watching, a history in 100 objects, and those 100 objects include, number one, the motor car, number two, airline industry, number three, the bird tourism industry, and number four, of course, the publishing industry. And if you talk about affordability, the last bird book that I bought maybe like 20 years ago costed me 5,000 rupees,
yes.
Which was, so it wasn't affordable.
Exactly.
And its market was actually not for people who live in India. The market was for transnational tourism. And for them, every gram that you carry in your bag counts. And in fact, if you look at the last major book, the Ripley Field Guide, came in two parts. The pictorial part, which was lightweight, which you carried in your travel, and the text part which you kept back at home.
The pocket editions, yes.
It was essentially made for the capitalist marketing industry, just like capitalism controls scientific publication industry and, you know, all the games of publishing count and all this stuff. So I think it gets glossed out of this whole picture of the evolution of
I agree with you. I had only 40 minutes. I have overshot. And if I had to include that, it would probably like be a lot more, but I completely agree with you that affordability is a smokescreen. It isn't really, it doesn't get affordable. But then the central question remains, if the same person who can afford an Aitken, who they are saying is expensive, and the price of Ripley's, whatever, you know, the Ripley Ali's book is as expensive, who is the reader? Who are the readers? Who are the popular, the public that are actually consuming these field guides and perhaps identifying birds, right? Affordability is definitely a smokescreen, but my job here was to describe how visual conventions, genre conventions are shaping the scientific bird at the end, which they are saying this is for the lay public. Very openly, right? It's a popular. My emphasis is on the popular, but the capitalist argument, I completely buy.
Nisha?
Yeah. So similar to that, another thing that I think played a role in this is in the time frame that you presented, which is the late 19th century to mid to late 20th century. There was another key change that happened, which is we kind of went from seeing a bird in hand to seeing a bird in the bush, because hunting was the culture and the practice. And oftentimes if you saw a bird but you didn't hunt it, people would doubt whether you actually saw it there, which was kind of the culture of the late 19th century. But as time changed, the cultures of hunting changed, the laws changed, and we went from that to observing the bird in the field and trying to identify it there. So previously, where you had the option of hunting a bird, bringing it back to your home, opening a multi-volume book with one page dedicated to its species, now you had to have something which you can carry with you and identify on the ground before you forget what it looked like. So there is also the change in the culture, which also necessitated the shift, because who had access to the field and in what way also changed.
Yes, there is certainly that. But again, I will go back to Aitken and a very telling passage that I could not say, sort of cite this in the talk. He says, this is Common Birds of Bombay that I said was really loved by Salim Ali, who himself fashioned himself as the first sort of ornithologist in the field, like actually studying birds in the natural habitats in the field, as opposed to collecting skins, right? Aitken says, the first steps may have to be taken through blood, and this is about hunting. He was a proponent of the study of living birds, etc., as opposed to the bird collectors, the shift that you're talking about. The first steps may have to be taken through blood, and I must own that in my boyhood, I was murderous in heart, but not in hand, for I had no gun, only a catapult. For this, I'm thankful. I seldom killed anything, while the hours I spent in stalking my game and watching for a chance of getting a fair shot taught me more about the personal habits of birds than I could have learned in any other way. Since that, I have shot a great many beautiful and harmless birds with ever-increasing reluctance, and there was no other means of becoming acquainted with them. The descriptions in Jordan and Barnes and Oates, all the sort of 19th century ornithologists, all presuppose a specimen in your hand to be measured with a foot rule and examined feather by feather. There was no museum to which I could resort, and it was seldom my lot to fall in with anyone who could enlighten me if I asked, what bird is that? Most gladly, therefore, would I try to make atonement now by helping others to know without killing, as far as it lies in me. My point is slightly separate. These are the kind of, sort of pathos that you really don't find in any sort of subsequent accounts of birds and bird books and so on. But your point that people will not believe you that you actually studied a bird, etc., because he's actually talking about watching, like how a predator waits, stalks its prey. He's saying just watching the bird before I'm shooting it is giving me enough information on its behavior and so on. Whether or not people believe is a whole different can of worms, because it is how is expertise formed is another sort of conversation we have in history. Like, how is expertise actually formed in a particular space and time? Who you are, your social stature, your professional stature, how much weightage your words have, so on and so forth, also along with the whole other stuff, goes into whether your words will be believable or not, with or without the skin of the bird. You know, but the shift is happening. Now, who is going to the field with this pocket, whatever edition, and doing, I have to go back to his point. I mean, it's true. How many people are actually doing that? I'm part of a Facebook group that says Indian birds, right? And it's all photography. It's actually fantastic. I mean, it's like, you know, there's a tractor behind a Sarah screen. I have that picture. You want more pictures of, like, you know, man, human wildlife cohabiting and so on. It throws up other vistas that you don't find in the field guide. But people are like identifying. People are not asking, what are the sort of, you know, the local lores around this bird? It's like, hello, I got this bird. This is a picture of the bird. Can you please help me identify? Right? So I don't know. I mean, I don't have an answer, but yes, I will say that many of the points that you mentioned, like the shift and with believability and so on, credibility and so on, they are all individual strands that I could probably talk about if you have time. But yeah.
We'll take two more questions, Siddharth, and then we'll come back.
Hi, thanks, Manjita. The way you frame the loss is something I really resonated with, because I also deal with very similar things. I wanted to sort of comment on the idea of a lay public or a general public, which is usually a misnomer. It's just throwing it out there and not really defining who you're doing it for. You sort of alluded to what the loss and what is the impact of that loss, but can you comment on the public and the loss that the public faces in terms of who these field guides or bird books were meant for, and what's really happening at that level in terms of whether knowledge about birds is being gatekept, whether expertise is being sort of constrained in certain ways. And so what is really the impact of whatever this loss that you've framed on the reader, on the public, right?
Short answer, no, I can't answer that question, because I will have to look at the subscribers list, like how many times there are all kinds of, it's a whole different set of archives that I have to look at, right? It cannot be gleaned from the stuff that I have just, worked with, because it's a question of how many people subscribe to BNHs, how many people are writing, how many people are reading. Sometimes those things, I don't even know whether I can actually get those. How many people are buying. The fact that a book has undergone 13 editions is enough measure of its success, right?
I didn't mean quantitative success, like more qualitatively.
How is it shaping the public?
Yes, public's opinion of bird watching, I would say. Do you have an intuition of that based on?
One, not in the late 20th century, but in the turn of, from late 19th to early 20th, there is a shift from bird keeping to bird watching being the emphasis of the public eye, right? Like drawing from life and bird keeping, pets, birds in captivity, whether it's menageries, whether it's the zoo, and Calcutta had the Barrackpore, zoo, which predates the Calcutta Zoo and even the London Zoo. It was the first of its kind, so on. So even Jamalara, who is a fantastic case. Sorry, I couldn't insert her in this narrative. She's kind of inhabiting this twilight space between this Anglo-Indian and this, in the sense that she has this anthropological eye. She's writing essays on the Munda mysticism, spirit world. She's writing on lores, the folklores, the folk tales of Chota Nagpur. But when she's starting to write a bird book, she's following the conventions of the genre. None of this is actually making it to the book, right? But she has that eye. She appreciates humor. She writes stories, first-hand memoirs, or even fictitious stories and so on. She has that, and she is a person who believes in, there is a certain emphasis in her writings that appreciates birds. It's not so much, it's bird watching through bird keeping. She also wrote famously, her only published work, I think, is Watching Birds, a children's book on, how to breed birds, how to keep birds as pets, right? So bird keeping is beginning to lose out on just random bird watching and bird identifying. So that's probably one answer, but I really don't know about the late 20th century. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. This was really fun, instructive, and it really emerges what you brought out in the end, that how does one think in terms of the illustration not really being what gives you the evidence of making of a scientific genre, but it's in the process of drawing that the knowledge emerges. Absolutely. Right? Yeah. So I was thinking of like two things that in that sense, the elimination of the habitat that you dwell a lot on, which is very, very productive in, I'm sure in the larger work, you're making a big case about that we can then question what is more scientific, which genre is more scientific or not, or that very definition of where science is emerging by identifying it as such or not. So I think that would be, at least to me, that would be very productive in a way to kind of go back to that genre and try to kind of reconstitute our understanding of that, right? Yeah. Because currently you've used that genre of what is eliminating to constitute what is coming after it, that is being rendered as scientific. But you are in a way showing us that that is an ideal, that is where not just the emotional connections are being lost, but those connections make the observation, make the science, make the real, right? So it would be great to kind of reconstitute that earlier moment. And in that context, which I'm sure would be a slightly different project or would require, would be to think about constituting the question of observation, science, art, genre for the pre-colonial, the Mughal archive, or the various vernacular archives, the various early modern archives, where you began. Yes. And I very much appreciated that you began there, not just in terms to give us a prehistory, but you began there because because Salim Ali is mining that. Correct. Right? Absolutely. So it would be in a way very interesting to kind of go back to that as well, to then think about reconstituting it. Absolutely. And just a side note over there is, I don't know, you may be aware of Sylvia Houteling's work on textiles. No, I don't. In one of the articles, and I can send it to you, she actually discusses that how the making of the leheria cloth and the writing about the dyers making the leheria is compared to the flying of the Saras crane on those geographies, and to think about that question of color and wave. And that, thinking about that work that Sylvia did, I was thinking about the question of observation with that earlier archive, and to think, bringing back in a way to that question of the lay person or the different experts, the different laboring castes who are, say, doing the dyeing, who are taking care of the birds, who are observing. So if you bring that poetic together, I would love to. Then in a way you can think about that early modern archive and think through that who is doing the observation and the theorizing on that science, which is only put down to the level of poetics often. Correct. And that's where I think opening the textile archive to it, if you decide to go that, would be very helpful. Absolutely. I have two more references. I'll give those to you separately. Sure. I mean, just to sort of, if I had to truncate my argument even more, like I'm talking about, since there is so much emphasis on the popular,
right? Whistler, Lee, etc. Keep on talking about the popular, 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 and popular with illustrations, right? So my thing is, how is everything that is popular about the popular is being trimmed and producing a certain kind of scientific popular, if you will, a professionalization of the eye. Following again Enderby's brilliant book. There too, he's like, drawing from older, early modern sort of botanical drawings, etc. There's just n number of ripple effects, like you said. I mean, where the poetics of it, etc. So the poetics was very much in the public domain at one point in time. And so, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Manjita. Really lovely. And I'm in agreement with, what Dipti said, but also I just wanted to go back to what Shamal was saying. And having said that, I really love the fact that you offer us the pre-colonial archive of bird observation. And Dipti is suggesting you push it even further.
Yeah.
Having said that, I really appreciate that. I am also wondering whether, to some extent, the threads that you're drawing may not end up comparing apples with oranges. In other words, and here's where I'm kind of echoing, I'm reformulating what Shamal says, that each of the genres that you showed us has its own economy within which it is produced and within which it circulates and and its own set of audiences to which it speaks, right? So now if you have Facebook communities or WhatsApp communities on bird watching, they are responding to a particular set of conditions, right?
Correct.
And in genre, those might actually recall the kind of facetious writing of the naturalists of a century ago, right? But they may not do so in terms of medium.
Correct.
Right. So here's where I would be more attentive to the question of genre and medium in order to thicken and to intensify the argument that you're making, right? So when you have Edwards making a painting of a Sarus crane on a background that looks unnatural or is unsuited, is stylized. So, I mean, so stylized or unnatural are both terms that I would encourage you to
unpack,
investigate.
Yeah.
Because what is that stylization doing for that moment when Edwards is making that painting? Is he perhaps recalling the cranes that are placed in Kalamkari, for instance, right? Is he actually doing observation, or is he rendering a poetic convention here? Or is he combining something? Is he maybe seeing this the rendering of cranes in bazaar art and saying this is how this is my translation of it, right? So here's where I would do the apples and oranges thing, because I'm convinced by the lineage you draw, but I think we could start unpacking it even more to see where each genre goes.
I completely agree with you. And like picking up artists individually and looking at, the kind of artistic influences and conventions that they're drawing from that make up, let's say, that stylized drawing of the Sarus. However, I don't think it's apples and oranges, because this stylized painting illustration is getting into a natural history book, a scientific book, right? Where he might have drawn his sort of, artistic conventions from a whole slew of, genres. I don't know what that is, whether that is like, indigenous to England or, European influences, colonial influences. I don't know. I don't know enough about Edwards. But the fact remains that that illustration is out of a page of a bird book, a scientific bird book. Perhaps the bigger umbrella genre here is like to try and map how popular science or popular whatever, ornithology, what did it mean in the sort of, late 18th century throughout the 19th? And what are the sort of driver's threads that they're pulling from? Some are sort of, getting knotted up. Some are being left, some are breaking, and some are being reinforced. Perhaps because that's the umbrella term. The point is, it doesn't stand alone as a painting. It is off a page of a bird book by an esteemed ornithologist, British ornithologist. So
much to discuss, but I would just say the term natural history itself, I think,
absolutely
give us some clues about the genre of science that bird watching belongs to.
I agree. I completely agree. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Amira. Thanks to all of you for your questions, and thanks, Manjita, for this lovely talk. If you're still interested in more archive events, we have 2 more tomorrow. And we will also have a few other research fellow talks in the next month and a half or so. So if you are on the mailing list, great. If you're not, do join. And I see. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining. And see you around.